American history is your history. It's about you, it's about your family, it's about our country. And the American dream belongs equally to you. And the American dream is surging bigger and better than ever before.
For decades, people have always believed in a promise. A promise that says if you work hard and follow the rules, then everything will be within your reach. That is the American dream, a symbol of stability and prosperity. However, today, if you visit major cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and even New York, you will see a reality completely different from what you imagined in this documentary. Right on the sidewalks, the American dream is trying to survive. They sleep on the streets, eat on the streets, lack clean water, and lack the most basic human necessities.
I always grew up thinking about the stereotypical American dream where you own a house and you have a yard to play in, and I think that dream is dying.
My husband and I came here from Las Vegas thinking that we had an apartment, and when we got here it was just way too expensive to live, and we tried to get into one of the shelters and they were full.
How bad is it out here on the street?
Someone who could be your friend at 6 o'clock and at night can be fiending for drugs and at midnight kill you because they know you have a couple dollars in your pocket that they want.
We have not seen conditions for humans like this since medieval times, period. And that's a fact.
What happens when in the richest country in the world, there are people who work every day, follow the rules, pay their full taxes, and still must live wandering and surviving on the streets? This is not an isolated case. It is a typical situation for more than 800,000 people living in homelessness in the United States. But the number alone is not the most striking part. What truly changes perception is how these people live. And this is where the story shifts. Some gain access to temporary shelters, while others live in cars, vans, or parking lots, adapting those spaces as if they were their only option. There is also a much harder to detect group people who are constantly moving sleeping in acquaintances' homes or switching motels every few days, what is known as invisible homelessness. In cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, or New York, this reality coexists with modern areas and active urban life, creating a contrast that is hard to ignore. But this is only the surface. What is most surprising is that many of these people work, have income, and try to maintain a routine, yet still cannot access stable housing. And that completely breaks the traditional idea of what it means to be homeless. And this is where the story becomes different. The most common explanation tends to oversimplify the problem, attributing it to individual decisions or a lack of effort. But the reality is far more structural and complex, and the problem does not begin where many people think it does. In many cases, everything starts with a change that seems manageable, a rent increase, an unexpected medical bill, or the loss of a job at a vulnerable moment. In the United States, the cost of housing has grown faster than wages for years, forcing many people to devote most of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. When someone is living on the edge with no room for savings, any unexpected event can trigger a chain of consequences that is difficult to stop. As a result, many people do not end up on the streets overnight, but instead go through a gradual transition, first falling behind on payments, then moving constantly, and finally losing all stability. For decades, the American dream functioned as a powerful narrative that defined not only the country's identity, but also the way millions of people understood success. The idea of starting from the bottom and moving forward through work and discipline created an aspirational image that transcended borders. But here, a contradiction appears. Today, that narrative has not disappeared, but its relationship with reality has changed. For many people, especially younger generations, accessing housing, education, or economic stability has become much more difficult. The cost of living has increased across multiple areas at the same time, creating constant pressure that limits opportunities for progress. This does not mean that success is impossible, but it does mean that the path is more uncertain and less accessible than before. The key difference is that now, effort does not always guarantee proportional results, and that completely changes the meaning of the American dream. When a promise continues to exist in discourse, but stops being fulfilled in practice, a sense of disconnection emerges that affects both those who are already within the system and those who are still trying to enter it. If this situation is viewed from a European perspective, important differences emerge that help explain why the impact is not the same. In Spain, for example, the public healthcare system significantly reduces the risk that a medical emergency will turn into an irreversible economic crisis. In addition, there are social support mechanisms that, although not perfect, act as a safety net that can cushion sudden downturns. There is also greater protection in certain rental contexts, which can provide more time to respond to economic difficulties. In the United States, by contrast, the model is based more on individual responsibility, which can generate positive outcomes in stable contexts, but also increases risk when that stability breaks down. The difference lies not only in the resources available, but in the moment when the system intervenes. In many European countries, intervention occurs before the situation becomes critical, whereas in the United States, in some cases, the response arrives when the problem is already advanced. This is not a question of one model being superior to another, but rather of approach. However, the practical consequences are clear in an environment where prevention is weaker. The risk of falling into extreme situations increases. In recent years, different cities in the United States have adopted measures aimed at controlling the visible impact of homelessness in public spaces. Some of these measures include restrictions on where people can sleep or set up encampments, as well as regulations intended to maintain urban order. However, these decisions generate significant debate because they do not always address the root of the problem. When available space is limited without offering sufficient alternatives, people simply relocate, changing locations without improving their situation. This is compounded by the continuous rise in housing costs, which maintains pressure on those who are already in a vulnerable situation. In addition, certain recent political proposals have introduced stricter approaches to the use of public space and access to housing, adding uncertainty about how the situation will evolve in the future. The key point is not only what measures are taken, but how they are implemented and who they directly affect. Because when policies focus more on visibility than on solutions, the problem does not disappear, it only changes form. If the problem is so visible, so constant, and so widely discussed, then an inevitable question arises: are there really solutions? The short answer is yes, but the real answer is much more complex. In different cities across the United States, multiple approaches have been tested: temporary shelters, job reintegration programs, targeted rental assistance, and local initiatives aimed at reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness in specific areas. On paper, many of these ideas make sense. They offer an immediate response, a way to ease the situation in the short term. But the problem arises when these solutions are not sustainable over time. Because getting off the street is not just a matter of finding a place to sleep for one night. It means regaining stability, access to services, and real opportunities. And that requires more than temporary measures. This is where an approach that has generated a great deal of debate comes in the Housing First model. The idea is simple, almost counterintuitive to some. Provide stable housing first with no preconditions, and then work on other aspects such as employment, health, or integration. Not the other way around. In several European countries, this model has shown consistent results, reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness, not just as a one-time goal, but as a structural change. But in the United States, its implementation has been uneven. Some cities have adopted it with positive results. Others have applied it in a limited way, without the necessary investment to sustain it over the long term. And this is where the real challenge emerges. It is not only about which solution works, but whether there is the willingness and the resources to implement it consistently. When analyzed more deeply, the problem does not seem to lie solely in a lack of ideas, but in how the system is designed. The United States is an enormous economy with significant resources, but also with a decentralized structure in which each state and each city has broad discretion to decide how to act. This creates important differences between regions. What works in one place does not necessarily carry over to another. In addition, there is a key element that often goes unnoticed. Housing is not only a basic necessity, it is also a market. And when housing becomes primarily an economic asset subject to investment speculation and profitability access, no longer depends solely on need and begins to depend on the ability to pay. That completely changes the balance. Because even if assistance programs exist, they must compete with a market that continues to drive prices upward. And when prices rise faster than solutions, the problem persists. In this context, many policies end up acting on the symptoms, not the cause. More shelters are created, but not more affordable housing. Controls are implemented, but the cost of living is not reduced, and so the system continues to function, but not necessarily to solve the problem. There is another factor that is not always mentioned, but that profoundly influences how this crisis is addressed, the way each society understands responsibility. In many European countries, there is a greater expectation that the public system will intervene to guarantee certain basic levels of well-being, not because it is perfect, but because it is part of the social contract. In the United States, the narrative is different. The idea of self-sufficiency, of individual responsibility, of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, is much more deeply rooted. And this has positive effects in many contexts. But it also means that when someone falls, the system is not always designed to support them immediately. It is not just a matter of resources, it is a matter of approach. And that approach defines how solutions are prioritized. Because when the problem is interpreted primarily as an individual failure, the responses tend to focus on correcting the person. But when it is understood as a structural failure, the solutions shift direction. And that is where the difference becomes evident. Despite everything, there is something that does seem clear when different models are analyzed. The solutions that work tend to be those that combine stability with ongoing support. It is not just about offering a place to sleep, but about creating conditions in which a person can rebuild their life progressively. This includes access to affordable housing, healthcare services, psychological support, job opportunities, and above all, continuity. Because the key is not to solve the problem for a week or a month, but to prevent it from happening again. In several European countries, this approach has made it possible to significantly reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness in certain areas. Not because the problem has disappeared, but because it has been managed differently. And that raises an important question. If we know what works, why is it not applied more broadly? Perhaps the most uncomfortable question is not how to solve the problem, but why it continues to exist on such a large scale. Because in a country with resources, technology, and organizational capacity like the United States, the persistence of this crisis cannot be explained solely by a lack of solutions. It has to do with priorities, with decisions, with approaches, and with the way what is urgent and what can wait is defined. It also reflects how society chooses to measure success, not only in economic terms, but in human outcomes. When growth and efficiency are prioritized over long-term stability for all, certain groups inevitably fall behind. And once they do, returning to stability becomes significantly harder. So the issue is not only about solving homelessness, but about redefining what kind of system is being built and who it is truly designed to support. In the end, the story of people experiencing homelessness in the United States is not just a story about poverty or lack of housing. It is a story about balance, about what happens when the system works, but not for everyone. The American dream has not disappeared. It still exists as an idea, as an aspiration, as a narrative. But the question is different. Is it still accessible? Because when more and more people work, make an effort, try to move forward, and still live on the edge, the problem stops being individual. It becomes something deeper. And perhaps the most important question is not whether the dream is still alive, but who can truly reach it? And who is being left behind? And in that gap between promise and reality, a deeper reflection begins to take shape. Because this is not only about policy or economics, it is also about perception, about how a society measures success and how it responds when that success is no longer within reach for a growing number of people. When stability becomes fragile and progress feels uncertain, trust in the system can begin to erode. At the same time, the visibility of the crisis forces a confrontation that is difficult to avoid. It challenges assumptions, disrupts expectations, and raises questions that go beyond housing itself. Questions about fairness, opportunity, and the kind of future that is being built. Perhaps the real turning point comes when the issue is no longer seen as distant or exceptional, but as something structurally connected to everyday life. Because only then does it move from being a problem to observe, to one that demands to be understood and ultimately addressed.